35-year-old Larry Wells is heading to work the early shift as assistant manager at Toys R Us.
We thought it was a perfect job for him because he was, a big kid, and he loved toys, and he loved the newest video games and whatnot. So he was just a lot of fun.
Larry is a devoted father to his 4-year-old daughter.
She's just this funny, sweet little girl, and she looks so much like her dad. He loved being a dad. He absolutely adored his daughter.
He took a lot of pride in being a great dad and a good family man.
We still need to get a few things for 4th of July.
Yeah, I'll grab it on the way home.
Larry and wife Jill have another baby on the way.
Larry was just thrilled. Jill and Larry had been together as long as I remember. They were high school sweethearts. They were very happy. I never saw them not happy. They were always very much in love. It was just one of those ideal relationships that, kind of that storybook romance.
There's just good people in this world, and that's how I define Larry and Jill.
911 emergency. Okay, what's going on?
I don't know. He was shot.
He was shot?
No.
At Toys R Us?
Oh my God.
Okay, what's going on there? Who's there with you?
Two of the staffers. I'm a staffer, and we have a manager. Jumping at 4 o'clock. We were unloading stuff.
Okay, is he alive?
I don't know. He's alive.
5:47 a.m., the Utah Harbor Dispatch Center received a 911 call from Toys R Us. There was possibly a shooter involved, which obviously is one of the highest priority, highest threat level calls you can face. So our officers that arrived on the scene were prepared to confront a gunman.
What's going on here?
It's Larry. He was shot. He's in the office upstairs.
That was all the information that they were given at the time. We didn't know if that possible gunman was still in the building. It was a very distinct possibility there was somebody inside that store laying in wait. Larry was slumped in his chair. There was blood on the chair and on the floor.
Still got a pulse. Cover me, thing.
He had a faint pulse and was showing signs of life. Immediately, they wanted to get him to an ambulance, get him to the hospital. He used what we call a fireman's drag, dragged him out.
A SWAT team is called in to secure the area.
The SWAT team's job is to go in, search the store methodically to make sure that there was no threat from the possible gunman.
The SWAT team determined Larry's attacker is no longer on the scene.
And once the store is clear, then they'll be able to open up the store for our investigation to begin.
Once the victim was put in the ambulance, it was clear that at that point it was a stab wound and not a shot.
Larry Wells is rushed to the hospital. A deep stab wound to the chest proves fatal, and Larry is pronounced dead.
This has obviously raised the stakes tremendously.
You're a human being. The feelings that you have are very strong, and you want to do everything you can to find out who did this to that person.
Police make contact with Larry's wife, Jill.
For Jill, it was heartbreaking for her. She was trying to process what had happened, but then she's trying to process the fact that she lost her husband, and now she's afraid of, where, am I safe at my house? Is my daughter safe? Just heartbroken about Larry, and they were scared for their own safety.
I was devastated, and I couldn't believe how Jill would be dealing with this, and her family, and Jill being pregnant. It was, yeah, just a real tough, devastating blow. Just the anger, frustration, sadness in what happened to Larry.
So we made our way to the office. There was a large amount of blood on the floor, large amount of blood on the chair, blood on the wall. It was quite shocking. One thing that struck me was there was a very loud noise, and it turns out that the phone itself had been off the hook. We did not find a weapon or anything that could have been used to assault Larry. As we were processing the office, we did find a 2007 Florida Gators championship hat on the floor. It was a goldish tan and a darker black colored two-tone baseball cap. It seemed out of place for an office setting. We photographed and we bagged that immediately. We wanted to get it down to the Central Police Service's lab to analyze the DNA on the hat brim.
Detective Scott Cascino arrives to interview Larry's co-workers.
There's a closed door. You have 5 people. One of them is now dead. They're obviously going to be on the top of the list for suspects. Now we had to try to ascertain whether they were involved or not.
Detective Cascino begins with the 911 caller.
Okay, let's start from the beginning.
We arrived for an inventory shift
And what time was that?
around 4 a.m.
Larry and his co-workers came in early to do some inventory and stock the shelves.
They locked the door behind them, continued to do their job.
At 5 a.m., they find one of the front doors has been opened.
And that obviously raised some eyebrows, and she went looking for Larry and then unfortunately found him in the office.
All right, you sit tight.
After we've spoken to the 4 employees who were at the store, all their stories matched up. They didn't appear to be involved.
None of them were suspects at all.
We had to turn our attention to what we did have. Toys R Us has quite an extensive surveillance system with the cameras that could have recorded exactly what happened, who did it. We needed to get into the DVR to see what that video footage contained.
Police locate the DVR in Larry's office.
The DVR had been pulled away from the wall and unplugged. The video feed to that DVR had been cut. We didn't know when it occurred, and what kind of footage we would have, what kind of footage we would not have. One thing we did know, we needed to get that thing up and running. The regional loss prevention manager for Toys R Us, Bernard Grusha, was called by Toys R Us corporate to go to the Blaisdell Toys R Us to see what assistance he can offer us.
We need to get a look at footage from the security cameras.
It was an exciting moment. We have the video. We're going to see what happened.
Larry had got there at 3:55 a.m. that morning.
Start just after 4 a.m. at the back of the store, please.
The protocol is that there's a walkie-talkie left at the front door. The employees show up. They radio for Larry to come open the door for him.
Say that again.
At about 4:08, Larry is seen on video opening the door.
roughly 4:08 a.m., Larry is observed on the camera in the back stockroom. Somebody enters the store. It was determined that Larry was letting the truck driver in who has brought the delivery for the day that the employees are charged with unloading.
The truck driver is let out the back door by Larry at 4:30 a.m.
All right, let's see the front doors.
The front doors allow access to both Toys R Us and the neighboring Babies R Us.
So at 4:24, the video camera pointed at the Babies R Us entrance. We were hoping to find why would that door be open when it absolutely should not have been open.
Wait. What's that?
You can see what appears to be a pair of legs. This dark figure wearing a dark clothes is at the doors to the store. He's there for a short period of time. The doors open, and we see this person enter the store briefly and then disappear from frame. This dark figure moving mysteriously. We got to find out who he is. But unfortunately, it was not the best video. It was grainy. It was tough to figure out fine details.
Can you follow them?
The next camera we see shows the Toys R Us side.
You have an individual who's kind of snaking his way through the store, through the aisles here.
He was using the shelving for cover, kind of stalking around the store, trying to evade the cameras, almost like he knew the store.
Go to the next camera.
We found the camera where he was walking down the aisle in the electronics.
Play that again. Pause it.
And at one point, you can see in his right hand what appears to be a very large knife.
Where's next?
Camera outside the office.
The office where the murder would take place.
You see the suspect going across the front of the store. He enters Larry's empty manager's office, shuts the door behind him. Approximately 4:32 a.m.
There's no surveillance footage inside the office.
We're thinking, we have the video, we have the recording, we're gonna see Larry enter the office, we're gonna see what happened between the suspect and Larry. The suspect is inside that office, laying in wait.
What happened?
At 4:39, the DVR stops recording. We lost what we thought was gonna be a crucial piece of evidence, All we had was the suspect entering. No idea what occurred. At one point, Bernie began crying. He told us that Larry was a friend of his. He was upset at the fact that Larry was killed. We needed to move on and try to find other evidence. We knew the suspect unplugged the DVR. So we boxed the cord up to send down to the Central Police Services lab to have that analyzed for DNA.
You do not know whether or not you're going to get DNA, but you're hopeful.
While they wait for news from the investigation, friends do what they can to support Larry's family.
I went over to Larry and Jill's house and brought her some flowers. She was there with her parents. And everyone was crying. Everyone was obviously in shock, devastated, and trying to process emotions. I didn't know what to say, how to say it. I was just doing my best to be there, and the only thing I could really say to Jill was that I'm sorry. I just always remember just, you know, having that feeling in my stomach, a lot of anger, why someone would want to do that to such a great guy. Someone's still out there who committed this crime and needs to be brought to justice.
Detectives review the store's security footage to try to identify the suspect.
We would continually go back to the DVR footage to try to see if we missed something, if something else would pop out. We were on the camera that showed the suspect coming down the electronics aisle. He was walking rather bow-legged, had a very distinct gait about himself. I noticed that the pants he was wearing appeared to be a pair of sweatpants. And the left leg had some kind of writing down the outside from the hip to the ankles. We couldn't discern what that writing was, but it was definitely distinctive. As we're watching, looking for that perfect shot to get the best angle to identify the suspect.
We can see dark clothing and has some type of a scarf or covering on his face. Now, unfortunately, we're probably never gonna get a picture of his face.
You notice we missed something?
There it is. The hat. That's it.
I look at the frame and say, oh my God, we got this guy's DNA. When I noticed that gator's hat that suspect was wearing, I said, that's it, we have that hat. That's the piece of evidence we need.
The hat that's on the floor in the office where the crime took place was the same hat that this dark, shadowy figure was wearing.
So at that point in time, we had two pieces of evidence that were, in my mind, crucially important to this investigation. One was that Florida Gators ball cap that would contain DNA of the attacker. The other was the DVR. The DNA results came back from the Central Police Services lab. That profile that was on the hat was also the same profile that was found on the cord that was pulled out of the back of the DVR. We had the killer's identity in DNA from him.
Once you get a DNA profile that is half the battle. The other half of the battle now is matching that with a human being.
Investigators search the FBI DNA database, hoping the suspect's DNA is on file.
Nothing. No hit in the database on the DNA that was found in the hat. This meant that this may have been a one-off. Possibly the suspect did not commit any crimes prior to this, any violent crimes. The DNA not being in there was definitely a disappointment. We were back to square one. We had to start finding different avenues to pursue our investigation.
Hi, I need a list of names of employees at the Hamburg store, please.
I felt that the person that was involved had an intimate knowledge of the store, and it could possibly be somebody who either works there now or worked there in the past.
Thank you.
So at that point, we were tasked with collecting DNA swabs from anybody and everybody who was associated with Toys R Us in Larry's life, in Jill's life.
When you have a long list like this, this isn't going to be a quick fix. This is going to take some time. Into the summer now of 2013, and we're striking out. We're not getting any matches at all.
We were not getting the breaks we would hope for. It was becoming very frustrating. We needed to find out who did this. We knew the family was hurting. They were looking for answers. We wanted to get this case solved.
As weeks turn to months, Larry's friends and family face an agonizing wait for answers.
With the police, they obviously don't share a lot of information because that's behind closed doors, and you want answers and you get angry and frustrated while you're not getting answers, or how come they haven't found someone yet?
Not having answers for even a day is challenging, no less, several months. I know for Jill, I think it was agonizing for her because she still didn't know, who had done this and was she safe.
It was tough, just kind of being left in limbo and no closure to it, and that's what I think everyone was looking for. Everyone was looking for closure to the case, for his daughters and for Jill. And Jill needs that as well, too.
Hamburg police request help from the FBI to develop a profile of the offender.
What type of person enters a store that early in the morning with a knife and kills somebody?
Sheena, I think I have an idea.
The profile points towards a male suspected of carrying a knife, but whose DNA is not on file.
We then searched our database locally. We came up with a name of a possible suspect. That individual had just gotten out of jail. He was arrested in a vehicle that was owned by an employee of Toys R Us. When he was arrested, in that vehicle, they recovered a large knife. We had not yet collected his sample of DNA.
All right, thank you.
We had to get his DNA sample.
A covert FBI team head out to track the man down.
Our best chance to collect DNA from the suspect would be to collect something that he had touched and discarded. He was observed in the back of a pickup truck driving down the street in the city of Buffalo. At one point, he was observed discarding a cigarette butt. It was a big break. We couldn't wait for the results. We had DNA of somebody we strongly believe was involved. The information that we received regarding the suspect, the connection to Toys R Us, and was arrested with a knife. We were really hoping that this was our guy. We had the results back. Unfortunately, it's not a match to the hat.
That's it.
We just felt defeated. We were starting to feel pressure. It was close to 3 months into the investigation.
With this suspect ruled out, detectives re-examine the case file.
What's next? Get that list of employees. Who's left?
Investigators check their database of DNA test results.
There was one individual who, when they would reach out to him to schedule the appointment, always had an excuse. I got a medical appointment today. I'm not feeling well this day. I gotta take my kid to a soccer game here. That individual who kept ducking the police and making excuses as to why he couldn't come down to give a DNA sample was the regional loss prevention manager, Bernie Lucia.
How can I help?
The same man who played security footage for Detective Crawford at the scene.
We realized that even though Bernie Grusha had been helping us out with the case, that we had not yet collected his sample of DNA. Trying to get the sample from him was difficult because he had obligations with work and his family.
He was away.
Bernie tells them that, hey, I'm away at a conference and I can't come in.
See if you can get him.
Police contact Toys R Us head office.
You need to get a hold of Bernie.
They tell his boss, hey, we know he's at a conference right now, but when he gets back, can you help us out here? And his boss says, what are you talking about? He's not at a conference.
Really?
Obviously, we're very suspicious. Our sights turn to him. We need to get his DNA.
Okay, thank you. Let's go pay him a visit.
Detectives track down Bernie to his father's house.
As we pulled into the driveway, the first thing I noticed on the back of his father's car was a Florida Gators bumper sticker. Just like on the hat.
We'll be looking for you. Gonna get a DNA sample? Yeah, sure.
Now our job was to get that down to the lab, analyze it, just like the other ones had done.
We'll be in touch.
The crime lab processes Bernie's DNA sample.
And they were able to compare it to the baseball cap and the cord. Bernie Grusha's DNA matched the DNA on the hat and on the cord.
It was a surprise, shocking, but we don't know. Is he involved in this?
Once you get the match, you want to confront the suspect with that evidence.
Detectives head out to speak with Bernie again. This time, they record the interaction on a body cam.
October 16th, we're heading over to Bernie's house regarding the Toys R Us homicide. Tom Brown and Scott Cascino will be doing an interview. Bert! What's up, bro? How you doing? Sleeping. Sorry about bothering you, man. Thanks.
They did not inform Bernie that he was a suspect or that his DNA was a match on the hat. At that point, we just wanted a statement from Bernie.
These are the two photos that I wanted to show you.
Detectives show Bernie images of the CCTV and the hat.
Just to see if anything sticks out to you. I mean, you can see the guys wearing the hat. Right. You ever see any employees or anybody in the store? Nothing like that. Nothing.
You feel them out, you throw a few things at them. You don't go in chronological order, all right?
You know the DVR the hard drive part of it wasn't pulled, obviously, because we watched the video. Right? The power cord was pulled. Right? Yeah. You know whose DNA was found on that side of the power cord? Mine. Well, I'm not surprised. I mean, I want to work with it.
He says, well, and it would be mine because, again, yeah, I touch that cord all the time, okay? I'm the security officer. So, all right, the detectives then move on.
There's one other issue, and it's a major issue.
Okay.
You never saw the hat. You don't know who's in that video. How is your DNA on that hat?
My DNA's on the hat? I have no idea. The only thing I could think of is the fact that I saw it. It makes no sense.
I think this got out of hand, and something that you didn't intend occurred that morning.
Holy guys, I didn't do this to Larry.
He was informed that the DNA was also on the hat. He became uncomfortable.
This is your opportunity.
Guys, I didn't do it. I'm sorry. I don't know what you want me to say. I'm not going to sit here and say I did it when I didn't do it.
You made a mistake that morning. Don't make another one today.
Bernie appeared to be, as the pressure grew, defensive. He was denying everything.
Whatever, guys. You say Bernie. Great. I didn't do it.
Not great. Because the only way you got
I don't know how it could be.
because you had it on when you watched.
As bad as whatever you guys have looks or whatever, I didn't do it.
We're past it. You know what? You need to get past it, too.
This is crazy.
You need to get past it.
I know the camera.
Right.
I know the system. If I did this, there's no way I would have left all this evidence.
He was cornered, and we realized he wasn't going to tell us anything.
So where do we go from here? I don't know. Do I need to get a lawyer or what? No, we want to keep talking. I don't want to keep talking. I didn't do this. I'm done. I'm not talking anymore. I want a lawyer. I'm done. I'm not talking anymore. This is stupid.
After Bernie said he wanted to speak with a lawyer, we had to cease our interrogation. We felt pretty strongly that Bernie was our guy. We developed a plan. We needed to make an arrest. We also wanted to gather evidence.
Police execute search warrants on Bernie's home address, his girlfriend's, and his father's property.
We were looking for any evidence that would link Bernie to the crime. We were looking for the murder weapon, anything that would help us solidify the case against Bernie and find a reason why he killed Larry. During the search of Bernie's house, in the garage, they found numerous items that appeared to be items from Toys R Us. Various games, electronic devices, high-priced items. Looking for any kind of electronic evidence. We recovered an SD card.
Detectives analyze the SD card and find video clips filmed at toy stores.
Bernie, being the loss prevention manager, used a small camera, a spy camera, to set up in stores to watch employees for employee theft, going through the numerous files on the SD card. We also found video footage of him at his house.
Bring up the footage from the store again.
And we can see the exact same walk, that bow-legged walk that we saw on the DVR.
Punch it on the pants.
Bernie was wearing a pair of black sweatpants with lettering down the left leg. that matched that was on the security video.
That's it. We got it.
Police traced the merchandise recovered from Bernie's garage.
Going through the records of thefts and burglaries at numerous Toys R Us stores, we found a pattern.
Bernie was allegedly engaged in stealing toys from various Toys R Us's and selling them on eBay.
We believe at that time Bernie was responsible for over $200,000 of stolen merchandise from Toys R Us stores in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio.
Bernie allegedly used his role in loss prevention to cover up his crimes.
He realized, I'm the guy that controls the security, I'm the guy that controls the inventory, I can do what I want.
Bernard Grusha is charged in the killing of Larry Wells. He pleads guilty to first-degree manslaughter and is sentenced to 25 years.
He deserves the full 25 years of maximum punishment, and that's what the judge gave him. They were friends, they were colleagues for 6 years. And then this same guy took his life. Just unbelievable. It's heart-wrenching and tragic.
And it was even more tragic when we found out why he was killed.
Bernard Grusha provides law enforcement with a detailed account of the crime. Facing mounting debts, Grusha goes to the store to rob the safe.
He had the keys. He wanted to make it look like he didn't have keys. So he made it look like he's jimmying now with the door, trying to force the door open. He then kind of sneakingly walked through the aisles.
Bernie is not spotted by any of the 5 members of staff.
He got to the manager's office of the Toys R Us, closed the door behind him, and unplugged the video.
After the security cameras are cut, Larry enters the office.
His plan was to get him to open the safe. Larry was not gonna let his store get robbed. They struggled. Larry tried to get the mask off his face.
Larry sustained 3 stab wounds. One in particular, a deep penetrating wound to the left side of his chest, which was the fatal stab wound.
And that's when Bernie took off and ran out of the office.
Larry just took that responsibility to protect things that were around him. That store, his coworkers were all very important to him. He treated all of those coworkers like they were family. He was going to do whatever he could to protect it at that moment and in that instance.
There's not a day that we don't miss Larry, and they think that the girls will always miss their dad. You can't look at these, these 2 little girls and their beautiful faces and not have, hope.
The things that I get to experience as a father and as a dad, Larry won't be able to do that. As his daughters get older, they didn't get a chance to know him as well as I did. So that's just really heartbreaking for me as a father and as a friend.
knew something bad had happened.
We had two individuals that had a hard time telling the story.
I ain't doing nothing wrong.
Everything I told you is 100%.
But the video was a lie.
In the early months of 1982, New York City moved with a kind of restless certainty that defined its era. Streets filled with constant motion, voices layered over one another, and lives intersecting briefly before continuing in separate directions. Within this vast and indifferent rhythm, countless stories unfolded every day, most of them unnoticed, most of them forgotten almost as quickly as they began. But among them, one story would leave a silence that never fully dissolved. It begins not with a moment of violence, but with its absence. A disappearance that at first carried no public weight, no immediate sense of tragedy beyond the private concern of those who knew her. There was no dramatic announcement, no visible rupture in the city's surface. Instead, there was simply a woman who left her apartment and did not return. That woman was Therese Ha-Kyung Cha, an artist whose work was still unfolding, still forming, still reaching toward expression that had not yet fully taken shape. At the time, she was living and working in New York City, a place that both absorbs and amplifies ambition. For many artists, it is a city that offers both opportunity and pressure in equal measure, a place where identity is constantly negotiated in public and private spaces. Cha existed within this environment not as a figure of fame or widespread recognition, but as someone deeply embedded in the quieter, more experimental corners of artistic life. Her presence was not defined by visibility, but by depth of engagement. Those who knew her described her in ways that resisted simplification. She was quiet but not absent, observant but not distant. Her attention seemed directed inward and outward at once, as if she was constantly translating experience into something more layered than ordinary language could contain. This sensitivity was reflected in her artistic practice, which moved across forms and disciplines, refusing to settle into a single category. Her work drew from literature, visual art, and film, but it was not simply a combination of mediums. It was an exploration of how meaning shifts when language is fractured, when memory is incomplete, and when identity is shaped across multiple cultural and linguistic frameworks. Having been born in 1951 in Busan, South Korea, and later relocating to the United States, she carried within her personal history the experience of displacement and adaptation. This was not presented in her life as a narrative of conflict, but as a condition of perception, something that informed how she understood the world rather than how she opposed it. By 1982, she had already established herself within artistic circles that valued experimentation over convention. She was not working toward mainstream recognition in the traditional sense. Instead, she was developing a body of work that engaged deeply with questions of memory, language, and the instability of identity. Her approach was deliberate and careful, often requiring time, revision, and reflection. Those who observed her work described it as intellectually demanding, but also emotionally precise in ways that were not always immediately visible. Her daily life in New York reflected this balance between creative focus and quiet existence. She moved through the city without spectacle, participating in artistic communities that were defined more by shared inquiry than by public attention. There was no indication that her life was marked by instability or external threat. Instead, it appeared structured around ongoing projects, intellectual engagement, and the gradual development of ideas that would later become central to her legacy. It is within this context that the events of November 1982 take on their weight. There was no public warning, no documented conflict that might have foreshadowed what would occur. The transition from presence to absence was abrupt in its outcome, even if the moment itself remains only partially visible through the limited details that were later recorded. What is known begins with her leaving her apartment in New York City. After that point, the record becomes fragmented. The absence was not immediately understood as something permanent. In a city of that scale, delays in contact or communication are not unusual. But as time passed and no information emerged regarding her whereabouts, concern began to replace uncertainty. The shift was gradual rather than sudden, moving from missed expectations to the recognition that something was wrong. Eventually, the situation escalated from concern to formal reporting, marking the transition from private worry to public awareness. The discovery that followed transformed the nature of the case entirely. Her body was found within the area of a building in New York City, a location she had reportedly visited on the same day she disappeared. This detail introduced a new dimension to the investigation, linking her final known movements to the place where she was ultimately discovered. The transition from missing person to homicide investigation occurred quickly once the condition of the body was confirmed. The nature of the crime, as later established through investigation, revealed that she had been sexually assaulted and then killed. These facts shifted the case from a disappearance into a violent homicide, altering both its investigative trajectory and its emotional impact. What had begun as uncertainty became an instance of irreversible harm. Yet even as these details emerged, they did not bring clarity about responsibility or motive. One of the most striking aspects of the case was the absence of a clear relational context. There was no documented conflict, no known personal dispute, and no identifiable connection between the victim and any specific individual that could immediately explain the violence. In investigative terms, this placed the case within a category often associated with opportunistic or random urban crime. However, classification did not translate into resolution. As investigators began their work, they were faced with the limitations of available evidence. The environment in which the crime occurred did not yield the kind of forensic clarity that might have supported rapid identification of a suspect. There were no definitive eyewitness accounts that could reconstruct the event in detail. The investigative process, therefore, relied heavily on circumstantial analysis and broader pattern consideration rather than direct evidentiary leads. Within this framework, attention was given to possible connections that extended beyond the immediate location. Among these was an inquiry involving a man who had at one point lived in Hawaii. This line of inquiry, however, did not result in any formal charges or legal action. It remained an unresolved aspect of the broader investigative effort, noted but not concluded, part of a case that was gradually becoming defined more by its unanswered questions than by its established facts. As the investigation progressed, several hypotheses were considered. One possibility was that the crime had been a random act of violence within an urban setting, carried out by an unknown individual with no prior connection to the victim. Another was that the encounter may have occurred within or near the building where her body was found, suggesting a situational interaction that escalated into violence. These possibilities remained open, but none were supported by conclusive evidence. The absence of a clear suspect, combined with limited forensic capability at the time, meant that the case gradually moved away from active resolution. Without new leads, without corroborating testimony, and without physical evidence sufficient to identify an offender, the investigation reached a point of stagnation. This was not a dramatic closure, but a slow transition into unresolved status. What remained was a case defined by its incompleteness. A life that had been actively engaged in creative exploration was interrupted without explanation that could be fully verified. An investigation that began with urgency eventually settled into historical record. And a city that had absorbed countless stories continued to move forward, carrying this one within its quieter layers of memory. Yet even at this early stage of understanding, it was already clear that the significance of the case would not be limited to its investigative parameters. It extended into questions about vulnerability, about the limits of forensic reconstruction, and about how absence itself becomes a form of narrative when answers are not available. The story of Therese Ha-Kyung Cha was no longer only about what had happened to her, but also about what could no longer be recovered. To understand the weight of what was lost in November 1982, it is necessary to step back from the moment of disappearance and examine the life that preceded it in detail. In cases where the outcome is defined by absence, the identity of the person at the center becomes the most stable reference point. Everything else, investigation, speculation, uncertainty moves around that fixed absence. In this case, that person was Therese Hack Kyung-cha, whose life had been shaped by movement between languages, countries, and forms of artistic expression. She was born in 1951 in Busan, South Korea, at a time when the country itself was still marked by the deep aftermath of war and Reconstruction. Her early life was not defined in the available record by public events or personal milestones of conventional narrative structure, but by the larger condition of displacement that would later become central to her artistic language. When she moved with her family to the United States, she entered a new cultural environment that required adaptation at every level, from language acquisition to social integration. This transition was not presented as a rupture in the dramatic sense, but as an ongoing process that would shape how she perceived identity itself. Unlike many artists whose work develops within a single cultural framework, Cha's creative identity emerged across multiple systems of meaning. She lived within English while also carrying Korean linguistic and cultural memory. This duality was not simply background context. It became a structural element in her work. Language, for her, was not a transparent medium of communication, but something fragmented, layered, and unstable. Meaning was never fixed. It shifted depending on context, memory, and translation. Her academic and artistic training reflected this complexity. She studied art, literature, and film, moving between disciplines rather than committing to a single artistic identity. This interdisciplinary approach was not unusual in experimental art circles, but in her case, it carried a particular intensity. She was not merely combining mediums. She was interrogating the limits of each one. Visual form alone could not contain memory. Language alone could not fully express identity. Film could capture movement, but not necessarily internal experience. Her work existed in the space between these limitations. By the early 1980s, she had become part of an artistic environment that valued experimentation over convention. In New York City, where she was living and working at the time, she participated in a community of artists who were engaged in similar questions about form, structure, and meaning. This was not a mainstream artistic career defined by institutional visibility. It was instead a quieter practice, rooted in intellectual exchange and creative exploration. Within this space, she was known not for public prominence, but for the depth and seriousness of her engagement with artistic questions. Those who encountered her work often described it as layered and demanding. It required attention, not passive observation. It asked the viewer or reader to engage with fragmentation rather than resolution. This approach reflected her broader interest in how identity is constructed across discontinuities. Memory, in her work, was not linear. It was interrupted, revisited, and reassembled in ways that resisted simple interpretation. Her most recognized work, developed during this period, would later be published posthumously. At the time of her life, it existed as part of an ongoing process rather than a completed artifact. She was actively working on projects that combined text, image, and conceptual structure. These works were not designed to offer closure. Instead, they explored the instability of meaning itself. The absence of finality in her artistic process is an important parallel to the absence that would later define her biography. In 1982, her daily life in New York City was shaped by this ongoing artistic practice. She was part of a network of individuals engaged in similar forms of experimentation, where collaboration and dialogue often replaced formal institutional structure. Her presence within this environment was consistent but not performative. She was not a public figure in the conventional sense. She did not operate within mass media visibility. Instead, her work circulated within more specialized and intellectually focused circles. This context is important because it challenges assumptions that violent cases must be preceded by visible conflict or public exposure. In the absence of such indicators, investigations often begin with broader hypotheses rather than specific targets. In Cha's case, there is no known personal dispute that could immediately explain what would later occur. There was no documented pattern of confrontation or public controversy that might have signaled escalating risk. Her life, as it is recorded, does not present the typical markers that investigators often rely on in reconstructing motive. Instead, what is visible is a life defined by intellectual intensity and artistic focus. Her engagement with themes of memory and identity was not abstract in the detached sense, but deeply connected to lived experience. The experience of migration, language transition, and cultural displacement was not external to her work. It was embedded within it. This does not provide causal explanation for the events that followed, but it does establish the internal landscape within which she was operating. By the time of her disappearance, she had already established a body of work that would later be recognized as significant within postmodern and diasporic literary studies. However, at the time, she was still in a phase of active development. Her projects were ongoing, not concluded. She was building toward future work that would never be completed in her lifetime. The environment of New York City in 1982 provided both opportunity and anonymity. It was a place where artistic communities could form without centralized structure, but also a place where individuals could move through space without sustained public visibility. For someone like Cha, whose work existed outside mainstream recognition, this environment offered both freedom and isolation. She was part of a community, but not embedded in a way that made her constantly visible to the broader public. This balance between presence and invisibility is important when considering how her disappearance initially unfolded. There was no immediate public alarm. The transition from presence to absence occurred within the normal expectations of urban life, where delayed communication is not uncommon. It was only as time passed without contact that concern began to develop among those who knew her personally. The later discovery that she had been found in a building area in New York City introduced a shift from absence to confirmed tragedy. The location itself, which she had reportedly visited on the day of her disappearance, became a central point in reconstructing her final movements. However, even with this information, the broader context of her life offered no clear indication of why she had been targeted. The investigation that followed would eventually classify her death as a violent homicide involving sexual assault. Yet this classification did not resolve the underlying absence of motive or identified perpetrator. It placed the case within a legal category, but did not fill the narrative gaps that remained. The contrast between the clarity of outcome and the ambiguity of cause would become one of the defining features of the case. At the center of this narrative remains the life of Therese Hack Kyung Cha, not as a symbolic figure, but as an individual whose work and existence were interrupted at a moment when both were still unfolding. The significance of her biography lies not only in what she created, but in what she was in the process of creating at the time of her death. Her story, as it can be reconstructed from available information, is one of continuous formation rather than completed definition. It resists closure not because it is incomplete in a narrative sense, but because it was interrupted before its trajectory reached resolution. In that interruption, the boundaries between life, work, and absence become inseparable. And it is from this point of interruption that the investigation must continue, moving from the portrait of a life toward the moment when that life entered the domain of unresolved crime. The transition from a living presence to a missing person in November 1982 did not occur as a single dramatic rupture, but as a sequence of absences that gradually accumulated into concern. In a city like New York City, where time is often measured in missed calls, delayed meetings, and unspoken adjustments, disappearance does not immediately register as permanence. It begins instead as a gap in routine, a silence where communication was expected and only later transforms into something more final. In the case of Therese Hack Kyung Cha, the last confirmed moment of her presence was her departure from her apartment. There was no indication in the available record of distress or disruption at that time. She left as part of what would have been understood as an ordinary movement through the city, consistent with the rhythm of her daily life. After that point, the record becomes fragmented, reconstructed only through subsequent discovery and investigation. When she did not return and did not make contact, those who knew her began to notice the absence in increasingly practical terms. At first, it may have been interpreted as delay or disruption in communication, something not uncommon in an urban environment where schedules are fluid and interactions often informal. But as time passed without any form of contact, the absence became more difficult to explain within ordinary expectations. The transition from concern to formal recognition of disappearance is often slow in such cases. It requires accumulation of uncertainty rather than a single triggering event. Eventually, the lack of information reaches a threshold where informal assumptions are no longer sufficient. At that point, the situation shifts from private concern to public awareness, and the possibility of harm becomes part of the investigative framework. The discovery that followed fundamentally changed the nature of the case. Her body was found in an area associated with a building in New York City, a location that had relevance because she had reportedly been there on the day of her disappearance. This spatial connection became one of the few concrete links between her last known movements and the site where she was ultimately located. It transformed the case from a missing person inquiry into a homicide investigation. The condition of the scene, as later established through investigative findings, indicated that she had been subjected to sexual assault and then killed. This information immediately reframed the investigative direction. What had begun as an absence now required reconstruction of a violent event. The focus shifted from locating a missing individual to determining how and why her life had ended in that specific location. In the early stages of the investigation, authorities in New York City approached the case through a set of standard assumptions commonly applied to urban homicides without clear initial suspects. One possibility considered was that the crime was opportunistic in nature, meaning that the victim had been targeted in a moment of vulnerability by an unknown individual. This type of scenario is often considered in cases where there is no obvious personal connection between victim and perpetrator. Another line of consideration involved the possibility that the encounter occurred within or near the building where her body was found. This would suggest a situational interaction, one that escalated rapidly from contact to violence. In such cases, the location becomes central not only as a recovery site, but as a potential site of interaction. However, without direct witnesses or conclusive forensic detail publicly available in the record, this remained a hypothesis rather than a confirmed reconstruction. From the beginning, the investigation faced significant limitations. The available evidence did not include clear eyewitness accounts capable of reconstructing the sequence of events with precision. The absence of such testimony meant that investigators had to rely on indirect indicators and circumstantial reconstruction. In the early 1980s, forensic capabilities were also more limited than in later decades, particularly in cases where biological evidence was either not preserved in usable form or not yet analyzed through modern genetic methods. As the investigation continued, attention turned toward any potential individuals who might have had contact with or relevance to the victim's movements on the day of her disappearance. Among the leads examined was a reference to a man who had previously lived in Hawaii. This connection was noted within the broader investigative context, but did not result in formal charges or a publicly documented suspect profile. It remained an unresolved element within the case file, neither confirmed nor dismissed in a conclusive manner. Investigators also considered broader categories of possibility, consistent with procedures for unsolved urban homicides. These included the likelihood of a random attack in a densely populated environment, where victims may encounter unknown individuals without prior connection. Another possibility was that the violence occurred as part of a brief and unintended escalation during a chance encounter. In both scenarios, the absence of prior relationship between victim and perpetrator is a defining characteristic. Despite these lines of inquiry, the case did not produce the kind of evidentiary breakthrough necessary to move toward prosecution. No suspect was formally identified in a way that met the legal threshold for charging. No confession was obtained. No physical evidence was publicly documented as sufficient to establish identity beyond doubt. As a result, the investigation gradually lost momentum over time, transitioning from active inquiry to unresolved status. Within the framework of criminal investigation, this transition is not uncommon in cases where early leads do not converge into a coherent suspect profile. Cases may remain open in a technical sense, but without active progression. They become part of a broader category of unresolved homicides, stored within institutional memory, but not advancing toward resolution without new information. The case of Therese Hack Kyung Cha thus entered a state defined not by closure, but by suspension. The known facts remained fixed: disappearance, discovery, cause of death, and lack of identified perpetrator. What remained unresolved was the narrative connection between these facts. The absence of that connection is what defines the investigative gap. From an analytical perspective, the case highlights several structural limitations in urban homicide investigations during that period. First, the reliance on immediate eyewitness testimony in the absence of advanced surveillance systems. Second, the dependence on physical evidence that may not always survive or be recoverable in usable form. Third, the challenge of reconstructing events in environments where countless unrelated interactions occur simultaneously. These limitations do not imply investigative failure in a simplistic sense. Rather, they reflect the constraints under which law enforcement operated at the time. The absence of resolution in this case is therefore not attributable to a single factor, but to the convergence of multiple investigative constraints combined with the specific conditions of the incident itself. As the case transitioned into inactive status, it remained part of the historical record of unresolved homicides in New York City. It would later be referenced in discussions of unsolved cases, particularly those involving victims from artistic or academic communities. However, no new definitive breakthroughs emerged from these references. What remains most significant in the reconstruction of this phase of the case is the clarity of what is known versus the absence of what is not. It is known that she disappeared after leaving her apartment. It is known that her body was later found in a location associated with her last known movements. It is known that she had been subjected to sexual assault and homicide. What is not known is the identity of the person responsible or the precise sequence of events that led to her death. This boundary between known and unknown defines the structure of the case. It is within this boundary that investigation operates, and it is also where it reaches its limits. The disappearance of resolution does not erase the facts that are established, but it prevents them from forming a complete narrative. From here, the case moves into the domain of interpretation and analysis, where attention shifts from reconstruction of events to examination of investigative response, legal outcome, and broader implications. When investigators in New York City began formally reconstructing the final movements of Therese Hack Kyung Cha, they were working within a framework defined as much by absence as by evidence. There was no continuous chain of surveillance, no digital footprint, and no comprehensive record of her final hours. What existed instead were fragments: the last confirmed departure from her apartment, the eventual discovery of her body in a building-related area, and limited contextual information linking her presence in that vicinity on the same day. The initial investigative direction followed a structured logic commonly used in urban homicide cases without immediate suspects. The first assumption was that the crime likely fell into the category of opportunistic violence. In this framework, investigators considered whether an unknown individual had encountered the victim in a chance situation that escalated into assault and murder. This type of hypothesis is frequently applied in cases where there is no established relationship between victim and perpetrator. At the same time, investigators examined the physical location where her body was discovered. The fact that it was within a building environment in New York City and that she had reportedly been present there earlier on the day of her disappearance made the site itself a focal point of analysis. In cases of this nature, The location can serve as both a recovery site and a potential interaction site, depending on whether evidence suggests that the victim was brought there or encountered harm in that space. However, the investigation immediately encountered structural limitations. There were no publicly documented eyewitness accounts that could provide a clear narrative of what occurred between her departure from her apartment and the discovery of her body. Without direct observation, investigators were required to reconstruct events indirectly, relying on timing, location, and any available forensic indicators. This type of reconstruction is inherently uncertain, particularly in densely populated urban environments where multiple unrelated activities occur simultaneously. One of the most significant challenges in the case was the absence of conclusive forensic detail that could identify a perpetrator. At the time of the investigation in 1982, forensic technology did not yet have the capabilities that later decades would develop, particularly in relation to DNA analysis and digital tracking. This meant that physical evidence, if present, had to be interpreted through more limited scientific methods. In cases where such evidence is incomplete or degraded, its value in identifying individuals is significantly reduced. Despite these limitations, investigators pursued multiple lines of inquiry. One of these involved reviewing individuals who may have had indirect or contextual relevance to the victim's movements. Among these was a reference to a man who had previously lived in Hawaii. This connection was noted as part of the broader investigative record. However, it did not develop into a formal suspect profile supported by sufficient evidence for prosecution. No charges were filed in relation to this individual, and no definitive legal conclusion was reached regarding any involvement. In parallel, investigators also explored the possibility that the incident was the result of a spontaneous encounter. This included the hypothesis that the victim may have crossed paths with an unknown individual in or near the building where her body was later found. In such scenarios, the interaction between victim and offender is brief, unplanned, and highly situational. These cases are among the most difficult to resolve, as they often leave minimal traceable connections between the individuals involved. Another hypothesis considered was that the perpetrator may have acted alone in a random act of violence within an urban environment. This category of crime is characterized by lack of prior relationship, absence of clear motive, and opportunistic targeting. While this explanation was consistent with certain aspects of the available information, it did not provide identifying detail that could lead to a specific suspect. As investigators evaluated these possibilities, they were confronted with the central limitation of the case, the absence of a continuous evidentiary chain. There was no confirmed sequence of interactions between the time she left her apartment and the discovery of her body that could be reconstructed with certainty. This gap in continuity meant that each hypothesis remained partially speculative, supported by general patterns rather than case-specific proof. The investigative process also involved reviewing her personal and professional context. However, no known conflicts or disputes were identified that could directly explain the violence. Her life, as recorded, did not include documented threats or adversarial relationships that would suggest targeted intent. This lack of a relational motive further reinforced the focus on opportunistic or situational theories. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that the case would not advance through traditional means without new evidence. No additional witnesses emerged. No new forensic breakthroughs were recorded in the immediate aftermath. No confession or admission of responsibility was obtained. As a result, the investigative momentum gradually slowed, shifting from active pursuit to periodic review. Within the structure of homicide investigation in New York City during the early 1980s, this transition was not unusual in cases lacking strong evidentiary anchors. Cases without suspects or definitive forensic leads often enter a dormant phase, in which they remain officially open but are not actively progressing. This status reflects not closure, but limitation. The absence of resolution in this case is therefore not the result of a single investigative failure, but the convergence of multiple constraints. These include the lack of eyewitness testimony, the the limitations of forensic technology at the time, the absence of a known suspect, and the situational nature of the crime itself. Each of these factors individually complicates resolution. Together, they create a case structure that resists closure. From an analytical standpoint, the investigation illustrates the challenges of reconstructing events in environments where interactions are brief, unrecorded, and unpredictable. Urban spaces, by their nature, generate vast amounts of transient contact. Most of these interactions leave no lasting trace. When a violent event occurs within such a context, distinguishing relevant interactions from incidental proximity becomes a central difficulty. The case of Therese Hack Kyung Cha ultimately remained within this category of unresolved complexity. The available investigative steps established certain facts with clarity, including the location of discovery and the cause of death as determined by examination. However, they did not establish the identity of the individual responsible, nor did they provide a complete narrative of the events leading to the crime. As time passed, the case transitioned into a status of unresolved homicide. It remained part of institutional records, but without active progression toward resolution. In such cases, the passage of time often reduces the likelihood of new evidence emerging, particularly in the absence of technological advances or newly discovered testimony. What remains significant in the examination of this investigative phase is the clear distinction between what was determined and what remained unknown. The determination of cause of death provided closure in a medical and procedural sense. The absence of suspect identification, however, left the central narrative unresolved. This separation between factual determination and narrative completion is a defining feature of the case. In the broader context of criminal investigation, this case highlights the structural dependence on evidence continuity. Without a continuous chain linking victim, suspect, and event, reconstruction becomes fragmented. Each fragment may be individually informative, but without connection, they cannot form a complete sequence. This fragmentation defines the limits of investigative certainty in cases of this nature. From this point, the case enters its final legal and procedural stage, where formal classification replaces active inquiry, and unresolved status becomes the defining condition. In the legal aftermath of the death of Therese Hack Kyung Cha, the investigation entered a phase that is often misunderstood when viewed from the outside. In cases where there is no identified suspect, no arrest, and no prosecutable evidence, the concept of a trial does not take place in the traditional sense. Instead, what remains is a legal classification shaped by investigative findings, procedural review, and institutional documentation. In this case, that classification would ultimately define the outcome more than any courtroom process. The authorities in New York City had already determined through investigation that the case involved homicide. This determination was based on the condition of the body and the circumstances surrounding its discovery. The conclusion that she had been sexually assaulted and then killed placed the case within the category of criminal homicide. However, classification alone does not equate to prosecution. For a trial to occur, there must be an identified defendant, sufficient evidence to support charges, and a legal framework capable of presenting the case before a court. In this situation, none of those requirements were met. No individual was formally charged in connection with the death. No suspect was brought into custody with sufficient evidentiary support to proceed to indictment. As a result, the judicial system was never activated in the conventional sense. The case remained entirely within the investigative and administrative domains of law enforcement. This absence of prosecution does not indicate absence of effort. Rather, it reflects the limits of what could be established under the conditions of the case. Investigators had determined key facts regarding cause and manner of death, but they were unable to bridge the critical gap between those facts and a legally identifiable perpetrator. Without that bridge, the judicial process cannot move forward. Within the structure of criminal justice in New York during the early 1980s, cases of this nature were classified as unsolved homicides. This designation carries specific procedural implications. It means that the case remains open in a technical sense, but inactive in terms of ongoing investigative priority. Files are preserved, evidence is archived, and the case can be revisited if new information emerges, but there is no active progression toward trial. For the family, friends, and artistic community connected to Therese Hack Kyung-cha, this classification represented a different kind of outcome. It was neither closure nor continuation, but suspension. The legal system had acknowledged the nature of the crime, but had not been able to assign responsibility. This creates a distinct category of unresolved justice, where recognition of harm exists without accountability for its cause. One of the defining characteristics of such cases is the separation between investigative certainty and judicial conclusion. Investigators were able to establish that a homicide had occurred. They were able to determine that sexual assault was part of the sequence of events. However, they were not able to identify a person who could be brought before a court to answer for those actions. This separation is crucial in understanding why no trial took place. In the absence of a defendant, the legal system has no mechanism to proceed to adjudication. Criminal trials are adversarial by design, requiring two defined sides, the prosecution and the defense. Without a named individual to occupy the role of defendant, the structure collapses before it begins. As a result, the case remains in a pretrial state indefinitely, regardless of the severity of the crime. Over time, the file related to the case was transitioned into inactive status within law enforcement records. This does not mean it was erased or forgotten. Rather, it means that it was no longer part of active investigative operations. It remains part of the broader archive of unresolved homicide cases in New York City, available for review should new evidence ever emerge. The designation of unsolved homicide carries a particular weight in legal and institutional contexts. It acknowledges that a crime has been confirmed, but it also acknowledges the limits of current knowledge. In such cases, the legal system is effectively paused at the point where fact-finding ends and accountability would normally begin. That transition point becomes permanent unless disrupted by new developments. In reviewing the procedural history of this case, it is important to understand that closure in the legal sense is not synonymous with resolution in the human sense. Legally, the case reached its endpoint because no further action could be taken within the existing framework. Humanly, however, the absence of resolution continues to generate questions that extend beyond procedural boundaries. The death of Therese Hack Kyung-cha therefore occupies a space that is both legally defined and narratively open. The law defines what is known, that a homicide occurred, that sexual assault was part of the crime, and that no perpetrator has been identified or prosecuted. What remains undefined is the identity of responsibility and the sequence of intent that led to the event. Within legal institutions, this distinction is essential. The justice system operates on the principle that accountability must be based on evidence that meets a defined threshold. Without that threshold being met, the system cannot proceed, regardless of the moral or emotional weight of the case. This is not a failure of intent, but a limitation of structure. The absence of trial in this case also reflects the technological and procedural context of the early 1980s. At that time, forensic science did not have the capabilities that would later become standard in criminal investigations. DNA analysis, digital surveillance, and advanced data correlation were either in their infancy or not yet integrated into investigative practice. As a result, cases that lacked immediate witnesses or clear physical evidence were significantly more difficult to resolve. Despite the lack of judicial proceedings, the case remained part of ongoing institutional memory. Cold case files are periodically reviewed in many jurisdictions, including New York City, in the event that new evidence or technological advances provide opportunities for re-examination. However, there is no public record indicating that such a breakthrough has occurred in this case. For the broader artistic and academic communities, the unresolved nature of the case adds another dimension to the legacy of Therese Hack Kyung-cha. Her work, which engages deeply with themes of fragmentation, memory, and identity exists alongside a biography that itself remains fragmented in its final chapter. The absence of legal closure becomes part of the historical context in which her work is now studied. From a procedural perspective, the case demonstrates the clear boundary between investigation and adjudication. Investigation establishes facts, while adjudication assigns responsibility. When investigation cannot identify a responsible party, adjudication cannot proceed. This structural separation is fundamental to the legal system, and it defines why some cases remain permanently outside the scope of trial. The final status of the case is therefore not defined by courtroom outcome, but by institutional classification. It is a confirmed homicide without prosecution, an active legal acknowledgement of death without corresponding legal accountability. This status is stable, unchanged over decades, and only alterable through the emergence of new evidence. In reflecting on this stage of the case, what becomes most apparent is the permanence of its unresolved condition. The absence of trial is not a temporary delay, but a structural endpoint. It marks the moment where the legal system reaches the limits of what can be established with available information. From this point forward, the case moves beyond legal process and into the domain of consequence and memory, where the absence of resolution becomes part of its lasting identity. In every unresolved homicide, there is a final layer that exists beyond investigation, beyond legal classification, and beyond the procedural boundaries of law enforcement. It is the layer of consequence that unfolds slowly over time, not in courtrooms or police files, but in cultural memory, artistic legacy, and the continued absence of answers. In the case of Therese Hack Kyung-cha, this layer has become the most enduring part of the story. After her death in 1982 in New York City, the immediate focus of authorities remained on the investigation. But as years passed and no suspect was identified, the case gradually shifted from active inquiry into historical record. What remained was not a developing investigation, but a fixed set of facts surrounded by an expanding field of interpretation. Over time, that interpretation became inseparable from her artistic legacy. One of the most significant developments after her death was the posthumous recognition of her work. Her most important literary and artistic project, later published and widely studied, gained recognition as a major contribution to experimental literature. The work itself had been completed before her death, but had not yet reached broad public dissemination. After the tragedy, it entered the world in a different context, one shaped by absence rather than presence. The publication of her work transformed how she was understood within literary and artistic communities. It was no longer only the output of a living artist engaged in ongoing creation. It became a completed body of work framed by interruption. This shift changed the way her artistic contributions were read, analyzed, and taught. Themes of fragmentation, memory, language, and identity that were already present in her work took on additional resonance in light of her unresolved death. In academic contexts, her work began to occupy a significant place in discussions of diaspora identity and postmodern literary structure. Scholars examined how her use of language reflected the experience of living between cultures, between linguistic systems, and between forms of expression. Her writing and visual work were analyzed not only for their aesthetic innovation, but also for their engagement with the instability of meaning itself. At the same time, the unresolved nature of her death became part of the broader narrative surrounding her work. While her artistic output stands independently, it is inevitably read alongside the circumstances of her life's end. This does not reduce the value of her work, but it adds a layer of complexity to its interpretation. The absence of closure in her biography mirrors, in a limited and unintended way, the fragmented structures present in her artistic practice. The case also became part of broader discussions about violence in urban environments, particularly in relation to women in artistic and academic communities. In New York City during the early 1980s, homicide cases without clear suspects were not uncommon, especially in contexts where forensic technology had not yet reached the capabilities that would later become standard. Her case is often referenced in studies examining the limitations of investigative methods during that period. One of the recurring themes in such discussions is the gap between known facts and unresolved responsibility. In this case, it is established that she was subjected to sexual assault and homicide. What remains unknown is the identity of the individual responsible. This gap defines the boundaries of the case and has remained unchanged over time. It is within this gap that both investigative limitation and cultural reflection coexist. Over the decades, her name has appeared in multiple contexts: literary criticism, feminist scholarship, diaspora studies, and examinations of unsolved homicide cases. Each context emphasizes a different aspect of her life and death, but none can fully resolve the central absence that defines the case. The unresolved nature of the investigation remains constant, even as interpretation evolves. In the absence of legal resolution, memory becomes the primary form of continuity. Her work continues to be read, studied, and engaged with, ensuring that her presence persists in cultural and intellectual spaces. However, this continuity exists alongside the permanence of unanswered questions. The legal system did not identify a perpetrator, and no subsequent development has altered that outcome. The emotional dimension of this absence is difficult to separate from the factual record. For those who study her work or encounter her story, there is often a dual awareness: the recognition of her artistic significance and the awareness of the violence that ended her life. These two aspects exist in parallel, without resolution between them. One is defined by creation, the other by interruption. From an institutional perspective, the case remains classified as an unsolved homicide within the records of New York City. It is preserved in archival form, available for review if new evidence emerges, but not actively investigated. This status reflects the legal reality of many cold cases, where time does not erase the classification but stabilizes it. The passage of time has not altered the fundamental structure of the case. The known facts remain unchanged: disappearance, discovery, cause of death, and absence of identified perpetrator. What has changed is the context in which these facts are understood. With each passing year, the case becomes less about immediate investigation and more about historical and cultural interpretation. In this sense, the legacy of Therese Hack Kyung-cha exists on two parallel levels. The first is her artistic contribution, which continues to be studied and appreciated within literary and artistic fields. The second is the unresolved nature of her death, which remains part of the historical record without resolution. These two elements are distinct, yet they are often discussed together because they share the same origin in her life. It is important to recognize that the persistence of her work is not dependent on the circumstances of her death. Her artistic achievements stand on their own merit. However, the historical context in which they are now read inevitably includes the reality of her unresolved homicide. This does not diminish her work, but it does shape the framework in which it is encountered. In broader reflection, the case illustrates how unresolved violence can extend its impact far beyond the moment of occurrence. It influences not only investigative systems, but also cultural memory and intellectual discourse. The absence of resolution becomes part of the narrative structure surrounding the individual's life, even when that life is primarily defined by artistic creation. Ultimately, the story of Therese Hack Kyung-cha does not conclude in the traditional sense. There is no final identification of responsibility, no judicial closure, and no definitive reconstruction of the complete sequence of events. What remains is a combination of documented fact, artistic legacy, and enduring absence. That absence has become the defining feature of how the case is remembered. It is not simply the lack of a suspect or the absence of a trial. It is the absence of completion itself. And in that absence, both the limitations of investigation and the permanence of memory are revealed. The city where it occurred continues to move forward, as cities do, absorbing new events while retaining traces of older ones. But for those who encounter the story, whether through legal archives, academic study, or artistic engagement, the case remains suspended between knowledge and unknowability. It is there that its meaning continues to exist, not as resolution, but as unresolved presence. In the years following the death of Therese Hak Kyung-cha, the absence left by her passing did not diminish with time. Instead, it settled into a quieter but more persistent form, one that existed not in public urgency, but in academic reflection, artistic interpretation, and the slow accumulation of cultural memory. In New York City, where countless lives begin and end without sustained attention, her case became part of a smaller but enduring category of unresolved histories that continue to resurface through scholarship and art rather than through investigative development. Her work, which had already been completed in fragments during her lifetime, began to circulate more widely after her death. The publication of her major literary project marked a turning point in how she was understood. What had once been an evolving body of experimental work became, after her death, a completed and finite text. This shift fundamentally changed the way readers and scholars engaged with it. The work was no longer part of an ongoing artistic trajectory. It became instead a final expression, shaped by the fact that its creator could no longer revise, expand, or respond to its reception. As academic attention increased, her work was placed within broader discussions of postmodern literature and diasporic identity. Scholars examined the ways in which her use of fragmented structure reflected the lived experience of linguistic displacement. Her engagement with multiple languages was not treated as a stylistic choice alone, but as a reflection of how identity is constructed across cultural boundaries. The instability of meaning in her work was increasingly interpreted as an intentional reflection of lived fragmentation rather than purely experimental form. At the same time, the circumstances of her death remained inseparable from discussions of her legacy. The fact that her life ended in an unresolved homicide created a contextual frame that inevitably influenced interpretation. While her artistic output stands independently, the knowledge of her fate introduced a layer of emotional and historical gravity that cannot be separated from how her work is received. Readers encounter her texts not only as literary artifacts, but also as traces of a life interrupted. In institutional archives, her case remains classified as an unsolved homicide. The legal designation has not changed since the initial investigation concluded. There is no identified perpetrator, no prosecution, and no subsequent judicial development. The file remains part of the historical record maintained by investigative authorities in New York City, preserved in the event that future evidence or technological advancement might allow for re-examination. However, no such development has been publicly documented. This stability of classification over time is characteristic of many cold cases from the same era. In the early 1980s, investigative methods were constrained by the absence of technologies that later became standard. DNA profiling, advanced digital surveillance, and integrated data systems were not available tools at the time of investigation. As a result, cases that lacked immediate eyewitness testimony or clearly preserved forensic evidence often reached procedural endpoints without resolution. The absence of resolution in her case has therefore remained unchanged, not due to lack of attention, but due to structural limitation. Investigators were able to determine cause and manner of death, but not identity of responsibility. This distinction is central to understanding why the case remains unresolved. The establishment of what happened did not lead to the identification of who caused it. Over time, her name has appeared in multiple fields of study, each engaging with different aspects of her life and work. In literary studies, she is recognized for her contribution to experimental narrative form. In cultural studies, her work is analyzed in relation to migration, identity, and linguistic displacement. In discussions of unsolved homicide cases, her death is referenced as part of broader examinations of investigative limitations in urban environments during that period. Despite these varied contexts, the core structure of her case remains unchanged. She left her apartment, disappeared, was later found deceased, and no suspect was identified. These facts form the fixed framework within which all interpretation must operate. Everything else exists in relation to this unresolved core. The emotional resonance of her case has also evolved over time. For those who encounter her work, there is often a dual awareness of artistic depth and unresolved tragedy. This duality is not imposed by the work itself, but by the historical reality surrounding its creator. The presence of unresolved violence creates a form of interpretive gravity that shapes reception even when not explicitly addressed. In educational settings, her work is often taught as part of broader discussions on fragmentation in modern literature. Students engage with her texts as complex constructions of language and identity. At the same time, the biographical context is acknowledged as part of understanding her position within literary history. This integration of life and work reflects the way in which artistic production and personal history often become intertwined in retrospective analysis. The unresolved nature of her death also contributes to ongoing discussions about limitations in criminal investigation. Her case is frequently referenced in the context of how investigative systems function when confronted with insufficient evidence. It highlights the dependence on physical traces, witness testimony, and technological tools that may not always be available or preserved. In this sense, her case is not only a personal tragedy, but also an example of systemic limitation within a specific historical moment. Yet even within this analytical framing, the human dimension remains central. Behind the classification, the archival record, and the scholarly interpretation, there is the absence of a life that was actively engaged in creative exploration. That absence is not resolved by explanation. It remains a fixed point that resists completion. As decades pass, the case continues to exist in a suspended state. It is neither actively investigated nor fully closed. It is preserved, referenced, and revisited, but not resolved. This condition places it within a category of historical cases that persist not because of ongoing action, but because of unresolved structure. The legacy of Therese Hack Kyung-cha therefore exists in two parallel forms. One is the continuing life of her work, which remains active within literary and artistic discourse. The other is the unchanged status of her death, which remains legally and investigatively unresolved. These two dimensions do not converge, but they coexist, shaping how her story is understood across time. In the end, what remains is not a conclusion, but a continuity of absence. The facts of the case are stable, but the meaning derived from them continues to evolve. Her work continues to be read, her name continues to be studied, and her case continues to be referenced. Yet the central question that defines the investigation remains unanswered. That unanswered question is not only about identity, but about interruption itself. It is about the moment when a life engaged in creation was brought to an abrupt and unresolved end. And it is within that interruption that the lasting presence of her story continues to exist. The passage of time has a unique effect on unresolved cases, such as the death of Therese Hack Kyung-cha. It does not resolve uncertainty, nor does it diminish the factual record. Instead, it transforms the way that record is perceived. In the early years following her death in New York City, attention was still closely tied to investigative urgency. But as decades passed, the focus gradually shifted away from what could be solved and toward what could be remembered. In this transformation, the case became less about procedural development and more about historical interpretation. The facts remained unchanged. She left her apartment. She disappeared. She was later found deceased, and no suspect was ever identified. These elements form a permanent structure that has not been altered by time or by subsequent investigation. What has changed is the context in which these facts are understood. Within literary and academic communities, her work began to occupy an increasingly central position in discussions of experimental narrative and diasporic expression. Scholars returned to her texts not only to analyze their structure, but also to explore the conditions under which they were produced. Her engagement with fragmented language systems, multilingual expression, and nonlinear narrative forms was examined as part of a broader inquiry into how identity is shaped across cultural displacement. This interpretive attention did not alter the content of her work, but it expanded its significance. What had once been read primarily within specialized artistic circles gradually became part of wider academic discourse. Her writing and artistic production were incorporated into curricula, research, and critical studies that explored the intersection of language, memory, and identity. In this way, her work continued to develop meaning even in the absence of its creator. At the same time, the unresolved nature of her death remained an inseparable aspect of how her legacy was encountered. Although her artistic contributions are not defined by the circumstances of her death, the historical reality of her unresolved homicide inevitably shapes the context in which her work is received. This dual awareness, artistic achievement and unresolved loss, has become a defining feature of how she is remembered. In institutional terms, the case remains unchanged. It is still classified as an unsolved homicide within the records of investigative authorities in New York City. No individual has been identified as responsible, no prosecution has occurred, and no subsequent legal resolution has been reached. The case file remains preserved in archival form, accessible for potential future review, but inactive in terms of ongoing investigation. This status reflects a broader pattern observed in many cases from the same period. In the early 1980s, investigative resources and forensic technologies were limited in ways that significantly constrained resolution in complex urban homicides. Without modern DNA analysis, digital surveillance systems, or integrated databases, investigators relied heavily on physical evidence, witness testimony, and immediate leads. When these elements were absent or incomplete, cases often reached procedural endpoints without identification of a suspect. The case of Therese Hak Kyung Cha is therefore not unique in its unresolved status, but it is distinctive in the way it has been preserved within cultural memory. While many unsolved cases fade from public awareness, hers continues to be referenced in academic, artistic, and analytical contexts. This persistence is largely due to the significance of her artistic contributions, which remain actively studied and discussed. Her work itself engages with themes that unintentionally echo the structure of her unresolved fate. Fragmentation, interruption, and absence are recurring elements within her artistic language. These are not reflections of biography in a literal sense, but they have become points of interpretive convergence in later analysis. Readers and scholars often note the way in which her texts resist closure, operating instead through discontinuity and layered meaning. However, it is important to maintain a clear separation between artistic intention and retrospective interpretation. Her work was created as part of an ongoing artistic exploration, not as a commentary on her own death. The meaning attributed to it in later years is shaped by historical context rather than explicit authorial design. This distinction remains central in academic discussions of her legacy. The unresolved homicide also continues to serve as a reference point in broader examinations of investigative limitations. Her case is often included in discussions about how urban environments complicate evidentiary reconstruction. In densely populated cities, such as New York City, countless transient interactions occur daily, most of which leave no traceable record. When a violent incident occurs within such a context, reconstructing the precise sequence of events becomes inherently difficult. This structural challenge is compounded in cases where forensic evidence is limited or absent. Without definitive physical markers or reliable witness accounts, investigators must rely on partial reconstruction and probabilistic reasoning. In some cases, this is sufficient to identify suspects. In others, including this one, it is not. As a result, the case remains defined by its boundaries rather than its resolution. Those boundaries are clear: confirmed death, confirmed cause of death, and absence of identified perpetrator. Within those limits, interpretation can expand, but resolution cannot be achieved without new evidence. Over time, the emotional weight of unresolved cases often shifts from investigative institutions to cultural and intellectual spaces. In this case, that shift has been particularly pronounced. The continued study of her work ensures that her name remains present in discourse, even as the legal system remains at a standstill regarding accountability for her death. The enduring presence of her work within academic and artistic fields serves as a form of continuity that exists independently of the criminal investigation. It allows her contributions to remain active within cultural memory, even as the circumstances of her death remain unresolved. This dual existence, creative continuity and investigative stasis, defines the lasting structure of her legacy. Ultimately, the story of Therese Hack Kyung Cha does not move toward conclusion in a conventional sense. It remains anchored in a set of established facts that have not changed over time, while the interpretation of those facts continues to evolve. The absence of resolution is not a temporary condition, but a permanent feature of the case as it exists within historical record. What remains is a life that produced significant artistic work and a death that remains without identified responsibility. Between those 2 points lies a space that continues to be examined, interpreted, and remembered, but never fully resolved. In the decades following the death of Therese Hack Kyung Cha, the absence left by her case did not evolve into resolution, but into permanence. In New York City, where thousands of investigations cycle through varying degrees of attention and closure, her case remained fixed in a category defined by factual certainty and investigative limitation. It is known what happened in outcome, but not known who caused it, and that distinction has not changed since the original investigation concluded. Over time, the structure of attention around the case shifted significantly. In the immediate aftermath, the focus was procedural, centered on determining cause, location, and potential suspects. As years passed without new developments, that focus gradually receded from investigative urgency and moved into historical and cultural reflection. This transition is common in unresolved homicides, where the passage of time does not alter the facts, but changes the framework in which those facts are understood. The artistic legacy of Therese Hack Kyung Cha became increasingly central to how she was remembered. Her work, particularly her experimental engagement with language, memory, and identity, continued to circulate in academic and artistic environments. Scholars examined her texts within broader frameworks of postmodern literature, diaspora studies, and multilingual expression. Her artistic output was not reinterpreted because of the circumstances of her death, but inevitably encountered within that historical context. What distinguishes her case from many other unresolved homicides is the continued presence of her work in active intellectual circulation. In many cases, unresolved investigations fade entirely from public discourse. In this instance, however, her artistic contributions ensure that her name remained present in cultural and academic spaces. This created a dual structure of memory, one rooted in creative legacy, the other in unresolved legal status. The investigative record itself has remained unchanged since the initial conclusion. The cause of death was determined to involve sexual assault and homicide. The location of her discovery was confirmed within the urban environment of New York City, specifically within a building-related area linked to her final known movements. However, no individual was ever identified with sufficient evidence to proceed to prosecution. No trial occurred, and no suspect was formally charged. This absence of legal resolution is not unusual in cases from the early 1980s, a period when forensic science was significantly more limited than it is today. Investigations during that time relied heavily on immediate physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. When such evidence was incomplete, unavailable, or non-definitive, cases often reach procedural endpoints without identification of a perpetrator. In that sense, the unresolved nature of her case reflects broader, structural limitations of the investigative era. Despite these limitations, the case has remained preserved within institutional archives. It is classified as an unsolved homicide, a designation that indicates both confirmation of criminal death and absence of prosecutable identification. This classification is stable and has not changed over time. It exists as a formal acknowledgement of what is known and what remains unknown, without movement toward closure. In academic and cultural analysis, her work is often discussed in relation to fragmentation and discontinuity. These themes are not interpreted as biographical reflections, but they are frequently examined alongside her life story due to the structural parallels between her artistic language and the fragmented nature of her historical record. Her writing engages with discontinuous narrative forms, multilingual expression, and nonlinear memory structures, which has contributed to sustained scholarly interest. At the same time, careful distinction is maintained between artistic interpretation and factual biography. Her work was created as part of an ongoing artistic exploration and should not be reduced to retrospective symbolic meaning. However, once an artist's life becomes part of historical record, interpretation inevitably expands beyond original intent. This is a standard dynamic in posthumous artistic reception and applies broadly across literary history. The unresolved nature of her death continues to function as a fixed point within this interpretive landscape. It does not define her work, but exists alongside it as part of her historical reality. In this sense, her legacy is structured by both presence and absence, the presence of her artistic output and the absence of investigative resolution. Within the legal system of New York City, the case remains in inactive status. It is neither actively investigated nor formally closed in a conclusive sense. Instead, it exists in archival form, available for review should new evidence emerge. However, no such development has been recorded in public documentation. The case remains in the same condition it reached after the initial investigative period. Over time, public memory of such cases tends to fragment in ways that mirror the limitations of the original investigation. Details remain fixed, but narrative coherence gradually disperses across academic references, cultural discussions, and historical summaries. In this case, the most stable elements remain the same: disappearance, discovery, cause of death, and absence of identified perpetrator. What distinguishes this case in long-term reflection is not procedural uniqueness, but interpretive persistence. Her name continues to appear in discussions of experimental literature, diaspora identity, and unresolved homicide cases. This continued presence ensures that the case is not entirely confined to archival silence, even though it remains legally unresolved. Ultimately, the story does not resolve into conclusion. It stabilizes into a permanent condition defined by factual clarity without investigative completion. The life of Therese Hack Kyung-cha remains documented through her work, while her death remains documented through investigative classification, but the connection between cause and responsibility remains unformed. In that gap between what is known and what is unknown, the case continues to exist, not as an active investigation, not as a closed chapter, but as a fixed historical reality that resists resolution. In the long arc of unresolved cases, there is always a final stage that exists beyond investigation, beyond classification, and beyond the formal boundaries of law enforcement procedure. It is not a stage defined by action, but by permanence. In the case of Therese Hack Kyung-cha, this final stage has become the only stable ending available, because no investigative development has altered the facts since they were first established in New York City in 1982. What remains, decades later, is a fixed structure of known elements: a disappearance after leaving her apartment, a subsequent discovery of her body in an urban building environment, a confirmed homicide involving sexual assault, and the absence of any identified perpetrator. These facts have not changed, expanded, or resolved. They exist as a closed set of information surrounded by an open field of interpretation. In the immediate years following the case, the focus remained procedural. Investigators worked within the constraints of the period, relying on witness accounts, physical evidence, and situational reconstruction. But as time passed and no additional leads emerged, the case gradually transitioned out of active investigative priority. This transition did not occur as a formal conclusion of understanding, but as a practical recognition of limitation. The case did not end in resolution. It stabilized in absence. Within that absence, the life and work of Therese Hak Kyung Cha continued to evolve in cultural significance. Her artistic output, particularly her experimental engagement with language, memory, and identity, gained increasing recognition in academic and literary fields. Her work is frequently studied within frameworks of diaspora studies, postmodern narrative structure, and multilingual expression. These analyses focus not only on form, but also on the lived experience of displacement embedded within her artistic practice. Yet even as her work gained recognition, it did so under the permanent shadow of unresolved death. This does not mean that her artistic contributions are defined by the circumstances of her death, but rather that they are historically situated alongside it. The presence of unresolved violence becomes part of the external context in which her work is received, even though it is not part of the work itself. This duality is essential to understanding how her legacy functions in contemporary discourse. In legal terms, the case remains unchanged. It is classified as an unsolved homicide within the archival records of New York City. No suspect was ever formally identified, no trial occurred, and no prosecutorial pathway was established. The case exists in a state of procedural suspension, confirmed in outcome, uncompleted in accountability. This is not unusual in cases from the early 1980s, when forensic capabilities were limited and investigative tools lacked the technological support that would later become standard. At that time, the absence of DNA profiling, digital surveillance systems, and integrated forensic databases meant that investigations relied heavily on immediate physical evidence and eyewitness testimony. When those elements were missing or insufficient, cases often reached an evidentiary ceiling beyond which they could not progress. The case of Cha reflects this structural limitation clearly. It is not a case defined by investigative collapse, but by investigative boundary. Over time, the cultural memory of the case has shifted away from procedural detail and toward interpretive reflection. In academic environments, her work is studied as part of broader discussions about fragmentation in narrative form and the instability of language across cultural contexts. Her use of multilingual structures and nonlinear composition is analyzed as a deliberate engagement with the experience of displacement, rather than as a stylistic experiment alone. However, it is important to maintain a clear distinction between artistic interpretation and biographical projection. Her work does not exist as commentary on her death, nor should it be reduced to symbolic reflection of it. Instead, it exists as an independent artistic achievement that has acquired additional interpretive layers through historical circumstance. The convergence of life, work, and unresolved death is not authored, but imposed by time and context. In the decades since the case, her name has also appeared in discussions of cold case investigation, particularly as an example of the limitations of urban homicide resolution in pre-digital forensic eras. In densely populated environments like New York City, the sheer volume of transient interactions creates a structural challenge for reconstruction. When combined with limited forensic technology, these conditions can result in cases where the event is understood in outcome, but not in attribution. This distinction between knowing what happened and not knowing who caused it defines the entire structure of the case. The investigation was able to determine that a violent crime occurred. It was able to establish the location and general circumstances of discovery, but it was not able to bridge the final gap between event and responsibility. That gap remains unchanged. As a result, the case exists today in a stable archival form. It is neither active nor closed in a definitive sense. It is preserved as a record of confirmed homicide without resolution. In institutional terms, this is a final state. In human terms, it is an incomplete one. The continued relevance of Therese Hak Kyung Cha does not come from the circumstances of her death, but from the persistence of her work. Her artistic contributions remain present in literary and academic discourse, studied for their formal innovation and conceptual depth. Yet the historical awareness of her unresolved death inevitably accompanies this engagement, creating a layered context in which interpretation and biography coexist without merging. This coexistence is not unusual in cultural history, but it is particularly pronounced in cases where artistic output is preserved while investigative resolution is absent. The result is a dual legacy, one that is actively developed through scholarship and one that remains fixed in unresolved legal status. These two dimensions do not resolve each other. They exist in parallel. In the final analysis, the case does not conclude in the traditional sense of narrative closure. There is no final identification, no courtroom resolution, and no reconstructed certainty that completes the investigative arc. Instead, there is a documented life, a documented body of work, and a documented death whose cause is known, but whose responsibility is not. That is the defining condition of this case. Not mystery in the sensational sense, but absence in the structural sense. An absence of identified perpetrator. An absence of judicial resolution. An absence that has remained stable over time, unaltered by investigation, and unchanged by history. What endures is the presence of her work and the permanence of unanswered questions. And between those two, the case remains exactly where it has been since 1982. Fully recorded, fully acknowledged, and completely unresolved. In the official records maintained in New York City, the case involving the death of Therese Hack Kyung-cha remains classified as an unsolved homicide. This classification has not changed since the initial investigative phase concluded in the early 1980s. No suspect has been identified, no arrest has been made, and no judicial proceedings have taken place in connection with the crime. The investigative timeline reached its final operational stage shortly after the initial examination of evidence. Authorities confirmed that the victim had been subjected to sexual assault and homicide. The location of recovery was established within an urban building environment in New York City, consistent with her last known movements. However, despite these confirmed facts, no individual was ever identified with sufficient evidentiary support to proceed toward prosecution. The absence of a suspect is not a temporary gap in this case. It is a permanent structural condition. Investigators were unable to establish a continuous evidentiary chain linking any individual to the crime scene. There were no confirmed eyewitnesses capable of providing a direct account of the incident. There was no forensic profile that could be matched to a known person. And there was no admission of responsibility or confession recorded in connection with the case. Within the procedural framework of the time, this placed the investigation in a category of unresolved homicide cases that could be archived but not resolved. In the early 1980s, investigative limitations were significant compared to later developments in forensic science. DNA analysis was not yet a standard tool in criminal identification. Digital surveillance systems were not widely deployed in urban environments. As a result, many investigations relied heavily on immediate physical evidence and human testimony, both of which were limited or unavailable in this case. As time progressed, the case transitioned from active investigation to dormant status. This transition is not formally dramatic within law enforcement systems. It occurs gradually. As leads are exhausted, investigative resources are reallocated, and no new evidence emerges. In this case, that transition marked the end of active inquiry, though not the legal closure of the file. The artistic legacy of Therese Hack Kyung-cha continued to develop independently of the investigation. Her work gained increasing recognition in academic and literary fields, particularly in discussions of experimental narrative structure, multilingual expression, and diasporic identity. Scholars examined her writing and visual compositions as complex explorations of fragmentation, language, and memory. This academic engagement has ensured that her name remains present in cultural discourse, even as the legal case remains unresolved. However, it is important to distinguish between cultural continuity and legal resolution. The preservation of artistic legacy does not alter the investigative status of the case, nor does it resolve the absence of identified responsibility. In institutional terms, the case remains stored in archival systems as an unsolved homicide record. It is accessible for review under conditions of potential future re-examination, should new evidence emerge. However, no such evidence has been publicly documented. No reopening of the case has been reported through official channels, and no new investigative breakthroughs have been recorded. This stability of status is a defining characteristic of cold cases from this era. Once investigative pathways are exhausted and no further leads are available, cases often remain in a static condition indefinitely. They are neither actively pursued nor formally closed in a manner that assigns final accountability. Instead, they exist in a suspended institutional state. The case of Therese Ha-Kyung Cha is therefore defined by three fixed elements: confirmed death, established cause of death, and absence of identified perpetrator. These elements have remained unchanged for decades. They form the complete factual boundary of the case as it exists in official record. Everything beyond that boundary belongs to interpretation rather than investigation. Over time, interpretation has expanded significantly in academic and cultural contexts. Her work continues to be analyzed, taught, and discussed, often in relation to themes of displacement and fragmentation. But these interpretations exist alongside, not in place of, the unresolved investigative record. The city in which the case occurred, New York City, contains thousands of historical cases with varying degrees of resolution. In this broader context, her case represents one of many that remain formally unresolved from the same period. However, its continued presence in cultural discourse distinguishes it from many others that have faded entirely from public memory. From a procedural standpoint, no further action is currently being taken on the case. There are no active investigative leads, no pending forensic analyses, and no ongoing suspect identification process. The file remains preserved but inactive. Its status is stable and unchanged. In conclusion, the case exists in a final condition that is not defined by resolution, but by permanence of uncertainty. The known facts are complete within their scope, and the unknown elements remain unfilled. No additional investigative development has altered this structure since its original classification. The life and work of Therese Ha-Kyung Cha continue to be present in cultural and academic contexts. The investigative case surrounding her death continues to exist in archival legal systems. Between these two domains, artistic legacy and unresolved investigation, there is no convergence point. What remains is a historical record that is complete in documentation but incomplete in resolution. And in that condition, the case continues to exist exactly as it has for decades, fully recorded, fully acknowledged, and permanently unresolved. In reviewing the long-term historical record of the death of Therese Ha-Kyung Cha, what becomes most apparent is not the evolution of investigative findings, but the stability of their absence. From a moment the case entered official classification in New York City, its core factual structure remained unchanged. There was no expansion of confirmed evidence, no identification of suspect, and no procedural breakthrough that altered the original investigative conclusion. This stability is unusual only in appearance. In reality, it reflects a common outcome in unresolved homicide from the early 1980s, particularly in dense urban environments where investigative resources were constrained by the technological limitations of the period. At that time, forensic science did not yet include many of the tools that later became standard in criminal investigation. Without DNA analysis, without integrated surveillance systems, and without digital databases capable of cross-referencing suspects across jurisdictions, investigators relied primarily on immediate physical evidence and direct human testimony. In the case under review, those elements were not sufficient to establish a prosecutable suspect. While the cause and manner of death were determined, the evidentiary chain necessary to link responsibility to a specific individual was never completed. This created a permanent gap between confirmed outcome and legal accountability. As the investigation aged, it gradually transitioned from active inquiry into archival status. This transition did not involve a formal declaration of closure, but rather a procedural stabilization. Once all viable leads had been exhausted and no new evidence emerged, the case was no longer actively investigated. Instead, it was preserved within institutional records as an unsolved homicide. Within that classification, the case remains unchanged to this day. The artistic legacy of Therese Hack Kyung Cha developed independently of the investigative status of her death. Her work continued to circulate in academic and artistic communities, where it became increasingly significant in discussions of experimental narrative form, multilingual expression, and cultural displacement. Scholars have examined her writing as part of broader studies on fragmented identity structures and nonlinear literary construction. Her work is often analyzed for its formal complexity, particularly the way it resists conventional narrative continuity. This resistance to linear structure has led to sustained scholarly interest, positioning her within important discussions in modern and postmodern literary studies. However, these interpretations remain grounded in the text itself, not in assumptions about biography beyond documented historical fact. It is essential to maintain separation between artistic analysis and investigative record. The meaning of her work does not depend on the circumstances of her death, even though the historical reality of that death inevitably forms part of the broader cultural context in which her work is received. This distinction ensures that artistic evaluation remains independent while historical awareness remains intact. From an investigative standpoint, the case continues to exist in a static condition. No new suspect has been identified. No additional forensic evidence has been introduced into the official record. No reopened inquiry has been publicly documented. The file remains preserved in archival form within the broader collection of cold case homicides maintained in New York City. This archival status is not unique, but it is final in operational terms. It means that the case is not currently active, but remains available for review should future developments arise. However, such developments are contingent on the emergence of new evidence, which has not occurred. The persistence of unresolved status over decades highlights a broader structural reality within criminal investigation. Resolution depends not only on the severity of crime, but on the availability and survivability of evidence. In environments where evidence is limited or degraded, even serious crimes may remain unresolved indefinitely. In this case, the confirmed facts remain fixed: a disappearance, a recovery, and a determination of homicide involving sexual assault. Beyond those facts, the investigative record does not extend. There is no additional verified information that alters this framework. Over time, the cultural memory of the case has shifted away from investigative focus and toward historical reflection. The continued study of her artistic work ensures that her name remains present in academic discourse. Yet the investigative file remains unchanged, illustrating the separation between cultural legacy and legal resolution. In this separation lies the defining structure of the case. On one side, there is documented artistic contribution that continues to be studied and interpreted. On the other, there is an unresolved criminal investigation that has reached procedural conclusion without identification of responsibility. These two domains operate independently, yet they coexist within the same historical narrative. The absence of resolution is therefore not a temporary condition, but a permanent structural feature of the case. It is not a gap awaiting future closure, but a boundary defined by the limits of what was recoverable at the time of investigation. In final assessment, the case of Therese Hack Kyung Cha remains exactly where it has been for decades within the legal record. A confirmed homicide without identified perpetrator, preserved within archival systems of New York City, and unchanged by time, investigation, or historical reinterpretation. What endures is not movement toward resolution, but the permanence of an unresolved condition that has become part of its historical identity. In the final reading of the case involving Therese Hack Kyung Cha, What remains is not a developing investigation, but a completed historical record defined by its boundaries. The facts have long been established and have not changed since the original investigation concluded in New York City in 1982. There is no expansion of evidence, no identification of suspect, and no judicial proceeding that followed the initial determination of homicide. This permanence is central to understanding the case. Unlike investigations that evolve over time through new forensic input or renewed witness testimony, this case reached a structural endpoint early. The cause and manner of death were determined. The victim was identified. The location and circumstances of discovery were recorded. But the final and most critical element, the identity of the responsible individual, was never established. That absence defines everything that followed. In the years after the investigation concluded, the case transitioned into archival status. It ceased to be an active investigative priority and became part of a broader collection of unresolved homicides preserved within institutional records in New York City. This transition is not unusual in historical context. Many cases from the same period share similar trajectories, particularly those originating in the early 1980s, when forensic science had not yet developed the capabilities that would later transform criminal investigation. At that time, DNA analysis was not available as a standard investigative tool. Surveillance infrastructure was limited. Data integration between agencies was minimal. Investigators relied primarily on physical evidence recovered at the scene, witness statements, and direct leads generated in the immediate aftermath of the crime. When these elements were insufficient or unavailable, cases often reached a point beyond which further progress was not possible. The case of Cha reflects this structural limitation clearly. It is not defined by investigative error or procedural failure, but by the boundaries of available methodology at the time. As decades passed, the investigative file remained unchanged. No suspect was formally identified. No additional forensic breakthroughs were introduced into the record. No new evidentiary developments were reported through official channels. The case remained in a stable state of unresolved classification, confirmed homicide, unprosecuted, and unsolved. Meanwhile, her artistic legacy continued to evolve independently of the investigation. The work of Therese Hack Kyung Cha became increasingly significant in academic and literary discourse. Her writing and artistic practice, characterized by experimental structure and multilingual expression, gained recognition in studies of postmodern literature and diaspora identity. Scholars engaged with her work through frameworks that examine fragmentation, displacement, and the instability of language. Her contributions are now widely regarded as important within these fields, not because of the circumstances of her death, but because of the complexity and originality of her artistic approach. However, historical context inevitably influences interpretation. The knowledge that her life ended in unresolved violence creates an additional layer of awareness for readers and scholars, even when not directly addressed in analysis. This duality, artistic recognition alongside unresolved death, creates a layered historical presence. One layer belongs to cultural production. The other belongs to investigative record. They coexist, but do not intersect in resolution. In legal terms, the case remains unchanged. It is classified as an unsolved homicide within the archival system of New York City. There is no active investigation, no identified suspect, and no pending judicial action. The file exists in preserved form, accessible for review should new evidence ever emerge, but inactive in operational terms. This status is final in practice, though not formally closed in a way that assigns accountability. It reflects a common category in criminal justice systems, cases that are fully documented but not fully resolved. In such cases, the investigative narrative ends not with conclusion, but with limitation. The passage of time does not alter the facts of such cases. It only alters their context. As years become decades, the investigative record remains static while cultural interpretation continues to evolve. In this case, that evolution has been shaped primarily by continued engagement with her artistic work. The enduring presence of her writing ensures that her name remains part of ongoing academic discourse. Yet the investigative case remains fixed in its original condition. The two trajectories, cultural legacy and legal record, continue independently, each maintaining its own continuity without convergence. Ultimately, the case stands as a permanent record of unresolved homicide within the historical archive of New York City. It is defined not by mystery in the narrative sense, but by absence in the procedural sense. An absence of identified perpetrator, an absence of judicial resolution, an absence that has persisted unchanged since the moment the investigation reached its limit. What remains is a documented life, a documented body of work, and a documented death whose responsibility was never established. That structure is final. It does not progress, and it does not resolve. It simply remains.